be your name.
Blessed be your name in a land that is plentiful, where streams of abundance flow. Blessed be your name. Blessed be your name when I'm found in the desert place, or I walk through the wilderness. Blessed be your name.
Every blessing.
Every blessing you pour out, I'll turn back to praise. When the darkness closes in, Lord, still I will say, blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your glorious name. Blessed be your name when the sun's shining down on me, when the world's all as it should be. Blessed be your name. Blessed be your name on a road marked with suffering. There's pain in the offering. Blessed be your name.
Every blessing.
Every blessing you pour out, I'll turn back to praise. When the darkness closes in, Lord, still I will say, blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your glorious name. Take away. You give and take away. You give and take away. My heart will choose to say, Lord, blessed be your name. Like give and take away. You give and take away. My heart will choose to say, Lord, blessed be your name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your glorious name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your glorious name.
Weapon may be formed.
The weapon may be formed, but it won't prosper. And when the darkness falls, it won't prevail. 'Cause the God I serve knows only how to triumph. My God will never fail. No, my God will never fail. I'm gonna see a victory. I'm gonna see a victory. For the battle belongs to you, Lord. And I'm gonna see a victory. I'm gonna see a victory. For the battle belongs to you, Lord.
There's power in the name.
There's power in the mighty name of Jesus. And every war he wages, he will win. No, I'm not backing down from any giant. 'Cause I know how the story ends. I know how the story ends. And I'm gonna see a victory. I'm gonna see a victory.
Thank you for joining us. I'm so glad that you can spend some time with us today. We are continuing our study of the Gospel of Mark. We are going to be in the last part of chapter 11, starting into chapter 12. And in our study, Jesus has finally made it to Jerusalem. This will be the last few days of his life, and immediately after his triumphant ride, which we looked at last week, through the streets of Jerusalem, there's this conflict that begins. And during this time, he's dealing with really what is a central issue for people. He's dealing with the issue for all people. And the basic question in everybody's life, no matter who you are, no matter where you live, no matter what age you're living in, this one question really rules over all others. What is the final authority in life? What is the final authority in life? What authority will I obey? Godly desires or human desires? Reason/science or faith? Government versus moral conscience? These are all questions every one of us must face at some point. And we're helped greatly by the words of Jesus in this account. They are profound. But before we really dig in, let's go to God in prayer. Father God, we thank you for today. We thank you for loving us and blessing us. And we thank you for being the authority in our lives. And I ask, God, that you help us as we talk and as we read and as we go through this study today, that we're able to see that truth, that we're able to truly see you as the ultimate authority, the authority in how we live, the authority in how we think, the authority in the things that we say and do. And it's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen. So last week, as we looked at this together, we saw Jesus cleansing the temple. That's a very famous story. He overturns the tables. He kicks out the money changers. Essentially, what Jesus is doing is he's swept out all the commercialized side of the Jewish faith, the Jewish religion. All that commercialized traffic was pushed aside. Then he did this very assertive thing, which really only Mark records. We're told that Jesus stopped the offerings. He stopped the sacrifices that were going on in the Mosaic system. Mark says he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. So he's putting a stop to all of it. This meant that he stopped the Levitical priests from doing their jobs. They were trying to carry out their normal duties as priests that were connected with the sacrificial system, and he would not allow them to continue. Think about that for just a second. Think about how very dangerous that was, how very daring this was for Jesus to do. Everyone would have been shocked, right? Everybody would have been stunned by Jesus' actions in that moment. These sacrifices and the whole Levitical system, these were ultimately a command by God to Moses. They were at the heart, they were at the very center of the life of this nation. Yet here was Jesus bringing this priestly traffic to a stop. I can't even think of a modern day equivalent. I by no means am Jesus, but this would be like me going to the Vatican and kicking the Pope and all the priests out of St. Peter's Square. Okay, would not be a good situation for me. Everyone would start screaming things like, "This is blasphemy." Everyone would be stunned by such an action, and I would most definitely be arrested. I'd probably be arrested before I even started. But now Mark records the reaction that follows. So Jesus has cleansed the temple. He has kicked all the priests out of their job and their duties and what they're supposed to be doing. And then Mark records now the reaction that follows this cleansing. It says in verse 27, again, they entered Jerusalem, they being Jesus and his disciples. Again, they entered Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking through the temple area. And the leading priests, the teachers of religious law, and the elders came up to him. They demanded, "By what authority are you doing these things?" Talking about stopping the priestly activities? By what authority are you doing these things? Who gave you the right to do them? So these leaders are clearly bent out of shape, right? They're bent out of shape by all the previous actions that Jesus has done. You can sense the bluntness. You can sense the sternness in their voices. They are starting to get real now. I mean, they were mad at him before. They didn't like him before, but now they're getting real. There will be no more fun and games, no beating around the bush. The issues are right down to the foundations, right down to the bedrock of the human condition. The religious leaders in this moment, they want to know. The disciples know it. That Jesus, he knows it. The religious leaders know that all that surface level stuff is done. So they come to him with this ultimate question. Who gave you the authority to do this? In other words, what gives you the right? Who do you think you are? And that question, that authority question, that question is behind all human behavior if you really boil it down to its basics. When you refine any issue down to its essentials, what you are left with is this whole issue of authority in our lives. Why do you act the way you do? How do you justify what you say? How do you justify what you think and you do? And even though we like to think that we are the authority in our own lives, no human is ever their own ultimate authority. We all refer to something other than ourselves, something that compels us, something that feels important, something that governs our decisions. And when we deal with this question of authority, we're dealing with what is absolutely basic and fundamental to all human behavior. And that is precisely what these religious leaders were asking Jesus about on this day. Now, just to be clear, these were no second-rate Pharisees from Galilee who were questioning Jesus. Jesus has been talking to people like that for years now. From a human perspective, this was a very imposing delegation. It was made up of Caiaphas, who was the high priest at the time, Ananias, Caiaphas's father-in-law, who was regarded as the actual high priest, considering he had been in the past and he would be again. He was also there. There was also the temple scribes. They were kind of like lawyers who interpreted the law of Moses. And then there were the elders, those who were officially appointed to serve in the Sanhedrin, which was the ruling body of the nation. So in Hebrew rule, there was Herod, who was the king, but not really a king. But he was there. But then you have the Sanhedrin, who is ruling on behalf of all religious law. So Herod took care of all the state stuff, but the Sanhedrin took care of all the religious law. They were the Hebrew religious authorities. So this was a very imposing, very distinguished council. People would have seen them walking down the street together towards Jesus, and they would have stood in some kind of reverence towards them. So this is imposing. But Jesus doesn't answer them with any kind of fear or timidity. What Jesus does in this kind of a pressure cooker of a moment is very revealing. The first thing he does is very coolly and with total calmness, he examines their own credentials. Then he predicts their own ultimate downfall. Listen to what he says. Verse 29. I'll tell you what authority I do these things if you answer one question, Jesus replied. Did John's authority to baptize come from heaven, or was it merely human? Answer me. Now notice the directness of those words, right? He puts them right on the spot. He takes that question, he turns it back towards them and puts them right on the spot. So this is starting verse 31. So they argued amongst themselves. So the high priest, the former high priest, the scribes, and the Sanhedrin, they were arguing among themselves. If we say it was from heaven, he will ask us why we didn't believe John. But do we dare to say that he was merely human? for they were afraid of what the people would do, because everyone believed that John was a prophet. So they finally replied, "We don't know." And Jesus responded, "Then I won't tell you by what authority I do these things." I love that answer. Jesus seized upon this remarkable question of authority by asking another question. He asked them about the baptism of John. He doesn't ask them about the ministry of John. They want to know about the baptism of John. He didn't even ask about John himself. He asked, was the baptism of John from heaven or from men? Now, why was that significant? You see, the baptism of John, it was something very different for the people, something new that had really never happened before. The priests had a whole bunch of ritual washings. Baptism was nothing new for the Jews. Priests had all kinds of ritual washings connected with their duties in the Levitical system. But this was always done according to a prescribed ritual, something that was done at the temple, some instances even at a synagogue. And they were always done by the priests or the leading Pharisee of a synagogue. But John was different. John wasn't either one of those things. He was not a priest. He was not a Pharisee. Yet he baptized. And he didn't do it in a baptismal pool. John baptized in rivers. He baptized in streams. He baptized wherever he could find enough water to do so. So this is something that was very new. John's baptism would immediately have aroused this question: by what authority do you give us a new ritual in Israel? Okay, so when people were being baptized by John, they would have thought, by what authority is he doing this? So Jesus seizes upon that same question of authority and says to these very, very important religious leaders, what do you think of this innovation of John's? Was it from God or was it from men? Now notice again how he simplifies the issue. He clears away all the non-essentials, right? He brings us all down to what really matters. Who is the ultimate authority? Is it God or is it humans? Because ultimately there are no other authorities. We are either trying to please God and obey God by being responsive to the truth that he reveals, or we're trying to please other humans, to manipulate them, to use them, or to gain something from them. Now it's clear from their answer that they knew Jesus had placed them in a very real dilemma, right? They had no doubt that this was a tough question. In chess, this is what you would call a fork, because no matter what you do, you are going to lose. You get to that fork, no matter what move you make, you're going to lose a piece. These religious leaders, they knew that whatever they said, they were trapped. If they said it was from God, Jesus had them. He would say, then why didn't you accept him? Why did you allow Herod to kill him? And if they said that he was from men, they knew that all the people standing around them would be very upset. Many of the people there loved John the Baptist. Many people were probably baptized. Many of the people standing there that day were probably baptized by John. So they dare not say anything about that either. So they copped out. They said, we don't know. And Jesus said, then I won't tell you by what authority I do these things. But he didn't leave it there. He went on to expose their dishonesty. By their answer, they revealed that they really did not care what John's baptism was about. They didn't care if it was from God or if it was from man. They were not interested in truth. They only cared about serving their own interests. Thus, they revealed themselves as being opposed to God's authority. They revealed that they were acting out of the intrigues and the craftiness of human means. So Jesus proceeds to make that fact visible by telling a story. And Jesus was a great storyteller. In this story, Jesus shows not only his authority, but also the truth about these religious leaders. Now remember who they are: the high priest, the former high priest, the Sanhedrin, and the scribes. He tells this story about them, okay? He tells this story about the religious leaders in Jerusalem at the time. Jesus says, a man planted a vineyard. This is Mark 12, verse 1. A man planted a vineyard. He built a wall around it, dug a pit for pressing the grape juice, and built a lookout tower. Then he leased the vineyard to tenant farmers and moved to another country. Now, the scribes and the Pharisees and the chief priests, they would have immediately recognized this story. They were very smart, very intelligent, very knowledgeable about the scriptures. So they would have recognized that Jesus is borrowing almost the exact words of Isaiah 5. And in the story from Isaiah 5, Israel, as a nation, is described as a vineyard that is brought out of Egypt and planted in choice land. And in that choice land, God dug a pit and built a tower to protect the vineyard. But then God came to his vineyard looking for fruit. And these Jewish leaders would immediately recognize that this was all about them. They would have no doubt that Jesus is pointing his finger directly at each one of them. Jesus was not pulling his punches even a little bit in this moment. And he continues in the story, starting verse 2. At the time of the grape harvest, he sent one of his servants to collect his share of the crop. But the farmers grabbed the servant, beat him up, and sent him back empty-handed. The owner then sent another servant, but they insulted him and beat him over the head. The next servant was sent and killed. Others he sent were either beaten or killed, until there was only one left, his son, who he loved dearly. The owner finally sent him, thinking, surely they will respect my son. But the tenant farmers said to one another, here comes the heir to this estate. Let's kill him and get the estate for ourselves. So they grabbed him and murdered him and threw his body out of the vineyard. Can you imagine being nearby and hearing the boldness in this very tense moment? Jesus was throwing this parable right in their face. He is describing to them who they are and exactly what they're doing. And indirectly, he is answering the question about by what authority do you do these things? He says, here's my authority. I am the owner of the vineyard. I am also the rightful heir to it. I'm the beloved son whom the Father has sent. You have killed all the prophets. You stoned and beat those who came from God. And now I am the Son. I am here. And he told these religious leaders what they would soon do. He explains to these religious leaders that they would soon beat him, that they would kill him, and they would throw him out of the vineyard. Jesus, in this moment, is under no delusions as to what is going to happen to him in the next couple days. But then he goes on to predict what would ultimately happen to these religious leaders, that God would have the final answer. So he asks in verse 9, what will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come back and destroy the tenants and give the vineyards to the others. Now, in Mark's account, it looks as though Jesus answers his own question. But Matthew records this a little bit different. Matthew shows Jesus asking that question, but it is the scribes and the chief priests who give the answer. Jesus tells a story and says, now in that story, what would the vineyard owner do? And Matthew records that the scribes and the chief priests said, they would say that, why, he'll come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to someone else. And then Jesus says, you are right, and you have judged yourselves. Then Mark continues in verse 10. Have you never read the scripture? Didn't you ever read this in the scriptures? The stone that the builders rejected has now become the cornerstone. This is the Lord's doing, and it is wonderful to see. The religious leaders wanted to arrest Jesus because they realized he was telling the story against them. They were the wicked farmers, but they were afraid of the crowd, so they left him and went away. There's this false religious authority that presumes to dictate and usurp power and usurp authority of what was never rightfully theirs. Yet Jesus makes this crystal clear that this is not the end. When human authorities act that way, you can remember that God is not through yet. In Matthew 28, Jesus reminded the disciples, "All power in heaven and on earth has been given to me." Jesus is the Lord of everything. He is controlling all of history, and he is the ultimate determiner of all that happens in human affairs. 40 years after Jesus' death, Rome was fed up with Israel. Rome was fed up with these leaders like Caiaphas and Ananias and the scribes and the Sanhedrin and Herod. They were done. So they surrounded the city of Jerusalem and they began their siege of the city. And the city really didn't last that long. All the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders were led away in chains, and they were dispersed. So these people who were standing opposed to Jesus in this moment, they were dispersed among the other nations, and they were never allowed to return to Jerusalem. This was the effective end of the Israelite religion, at least in the way that they had known for so long. In 70 AD, the Romans destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. They looted all of its sacred contents, and with no temple, with no priests, no Holy of Holies, there could be no sacrifices, and thus there could be no Mosaic Judaism. Huge numbers of Jews left Judea to make a home somewhere else. God did exactly what he said he would do in this parable. And this is a lesson to all of us who read this account. Human authority is always limited. Human authority is always limited. It can never be equated with God's rule and authority. Human authority is always limited. Humans can only sit in a seat of power for so long. But sooner or later, something will happen that sweeps them out of office. There's a famous Christian writer named J.B. Phillips. He once said this: "Remember that the powers that be will soon be the powers that have been." No human constructed power can remain in control for very long. Human power and authority are always limited in duration. But Jesus soon has another encounter with another form of human authority. Verse 13. Later, the leaders, still talking about the chief priests and scribes, they got together and they sent another delegation. So later the leaders sent some Pharisees and supporters of Herod to trap Jesus into something for which he could be arrested. "Teacher," they said, talking to Jesus, "we know how honest you are. You are impartial and don't play favorites. You teach the way of God truthfully." So this sounds like a good start, right? It sounds like they're approaching in a good way. But are you familiar with the term scoundrel? Are you familiar with that phrase, scoundrel? A scoundrel is a highly dishonest and unscrupulous individual. That's the word that comes to mind when I think about these leaders that are sent in this moment. What a group of scoundrels these leaders were. They came up with these pious sounding words. They sounded like they were trying to honor Jesus, and yet they are made up of two groups that hated each other. The Pharisees and the Herodians, they were political enemies. They couldn't stand each other. They only got together here because they were both confronted with the threat of Jesus. Jesus threatened their vested interests. So they came to him with this question. They must have gotten together and worked out the perfect question. And they said, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay them or should we not? And in many ways, we still ask that question, right? Should I pay my taxes to a power that uses them wrongly? Is it right to pay our good, hard-earned money to a government that wastes it or spends it on a purpose that I adamantly oppose? Should I or shouldn't I? That's a good question. We still ask it. But here, in verse 15, Jesus saw through their hypocrisy and said, why are you trying to trap me? Show me a Roman coin and I'll tell you. When they handed it to him, he asked, whose picture and title are stamped on it? Caesar's, they replied. Well then, Jesus said, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and give to God what belongs to God. His reply completely amazed them. So Jesus didn't try to answer this question directly. He simply asked for a coin and then he held it up. He wanted to know whose picture's on it. They said it was Caesar's. All right, then it must be Caesar's money. So give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. I don't care about these things. But God, here's what Jesus does care about. But God has put his personal stamp on you. Caesar put his stamp on money, but God has put his stamp on you as his people. So render to God the things that are God's. So he shows us clearly that human authority is not only limited in duration, but it's also limited in scope. Jesus does recognize that human authority is a real thing. He's not denying human authority. Peter, when he wrote years later, he would say, honor the emperor as supreme and all the governors who were sent by him in 1 Peter 2. Fun fact, the emperor that Peter is referring to here is none other than Nero. Nero, if you don't familiar with history, Nero was one of the most wretched, immoral, degenerate people, not just to rule Rome, but to rule any nation ever. You look on BuzzFeed of world's worst leaders, he's on there, I guarantee it. Yet Peter says, honor the emperor, honor Nero as supreme human authority. But Jesus does say human government only has limited control. It has certain powers over our body, maybe, and minds to some extent. It can regulate some of our conduct to a degree. It has the right to influence and regulate our actions and what we say and how we say it even, at least to some extent. But there is one area of human life which secular power, doesn't matter if it's Nero or the President of the United States or whoever it is, there's one area of human life which a secular power has no control, and that is over the human spirit. Secular power cannot out-legislate God. It has no control over who governs our conscience. And they have no say in who the ultimate authority in my life is. So Jesus says, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. And certain things do properly belong to Caesar. And that's fine. You should pay your taxes. But, and this is a big but, I cannot lie, with regard to the ultimate issues of life, those things that belong to God only belong to God, not to any human authority. Human authority is therefore limited in its duration. It's limited in its scope. And now we have one more incident in this narrative on authority. Jesus is confronted with another form of human authority. He now has to deal with the authority of the mind. Rationalism, or as author John Piper suggests, the scientific mind tries to claim authority and power over our thinking. And this is very much still a problem today. This is the kind of question that the Sadducees are trying to catch Jesus on this day, starting in verse 18. Then Jesus was approached by some Sadducees. So this is another leading religious group in Jerusalem. He was approached by some Sadducees, the religious leaders who say there is no resurrection from the dead. They're on the exact opposite side of the Pharisees. They pose this question. Teacher, Moses gave us a law that if a man dies, leaving a wife without children, his brother should marry the widow and have a child who will carry on the brother's name. Well, suppose there were 7 brothers. The oldest one married and then died without children. So the second brother married the widow, but he also died without children. Then the third brother married her, and this continued with all 7 of them. And still there were no children. Last of all, the woman also died. So tell us, whose wife will she be in the resurrection? For all 7 were married to her. Now this is an utterly ridiculous question. It's utterly ridiculous and almost mocking Jesus. Mark makes this very clear. He tells us right at the beginning of this story that the Sadducees, they were rationalists. They were materialists. They were what we would call as humanists. They did not believe in the supernatural. They did not believe in angels. They did not believe in spirits or that there was anything that was invisible. They did not believe in life after death. They didn't believe in resurrection. And as Mark clearly states, and yet they come up with the question, what's going to happen in the resurrection? You can see them almost sneering, right? They're asking Jesus this question, trying to propose it as a serious question, but deep down they know it's not. They're just sneering, hoping that he's going to say something. It's absurd. This whole story is contrived. It's concocted just to try and trap Jesus. It never really happened, and I doubt that it could happen. It is simply a ridiculous story that they made up. And I'm sure Jesus must have been tempted to treat it as such. I personally would have answered, well, has anybody looked at her cooking? When someone has 7 husbands, one after the other, all of whom die, there's probably something going on in the kitchen. But Jesus answers them, your mistake, this is starting verse 24, your mistake is that you don't know the scriptures and you don't know the power of God. For when the dead rise, they will neither marry nor be given in marriage. In this respect, they will be like angels in heaven. But now, as to whether the dead will be raised, haven't you ever read about this in the writings of Moses and in the story of the burning bush? Long after Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had died, God said to Moses, I am the God of Abraham, God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. So he is the God of the living, not the dead. You have made a serious error. Now, these were educated men, and Jesus is being very blunt. Once again, he's tired of pulling punches. Not that he ever really did, but he's not mincing his words in any way. He straight up says, you're wrong. Your whole world view, your whole view of life is made you wrong. You are so sure that you're right that you have narrowed life down to a very limited view, and you say that this is all that there is. And looking at life from this narrow perspective, you cannot see the reality that lies beyond. And he says you are wrong because you fail to recognize 2 great facts. Number 1, God has knowledge that we as people simply do not have. God's knowledge is greater than ours. That is why he gave us the Bible. Jesus says to these Sadducees, but you don't know the Bible. And that's the folly, that's the problem of all people who reject the scriptures. When people do this, they lock themselves into this narrow slice of life. They're bound only by that which can be seen and felt and weighed and measured and verified by the senses. And when we do this, we create beings that have become bound by life. So Jesus says that you don't only not know the Word of God, you also don't know the power of God. So it is possible that they might have had some knowledge of these words, but they didn't know them. They didn't understand the power in them. If you don't believe it, if you don't believe in the words of God, then you're missing out on the power of God. And if you don't know the power of God's word, then you've bound your life to human knowledge. You've bound your life simply to human power. You've exalted humans to the place of ultimate knowledge and power. And this thinking is so very, very wrong. And that's where Jesus sees these people, these Sadducees at. No matter what area of life you're looking to, business, science, religion, politics, our family life, every error in life can be attributed to one of those two things. Either you don't know the scriptures or you don't know the power of God. When we do not know what a living God can do, and if we do not know what a living God knows, then we are simply going to be wrong every single time. This is the fatal weakness of what we call the rational mind. We must always recognize what Blaise Pascal put so beautifully when he wrote, "The ultimate purpose of reason is to bring us to the place where we see that there is a limit to reason." That is what is wrong with the scientific, rational mind. These Sadducees, they were excluding all the supernatural from their thinking. They would have agreed with Stephen Hawking, who said, "In the scientific realm, there is no room for speculation about life after death. Nobody can prove it or verify it. Nobody who has been there has ever come back. Therefore, it is an irrelevant fact that has no meaning to life." But Jesus says, you're wrong. The reason you're wrong is that you do not see the ultimate reality. Now, on one level, I understand what Hawking and these Sadducees would have been saying. Themes like life after death and the resurrection have little to do with our examination of the here and now. But what these individuals do not see is that they are more than just scientists, right? They're more than just scientists. Ultimately, they are a being. They are a human being, and as a person, we cannot escape the problem of our humanity. We cannot escape the problem of death. Everyone someday must confront the reality of their own death. And this is true with many aspects of life. If we refuse the supernatural, we're severely limiting ourselves. And this is what Jesus was trying to get us to understand. Human authority is limited in its duration, it's limited in its scope, and human authority also only deals with part of a person, so it's limited in its dimensions. It only deals with time, not with eternity. In contrast, though, God's authority rings through this passage as being worthy of obedience. God's authority, in contrast with human authority, encompasses all time. It never changes. It is never one thing during this age and something else in another age. It is never overthrown. It is exactly today as it was in Abraham's day, as it was in Isaac's day, as it was in Moses' day. God's authority and power govern the whole of all humankind. God's authority reaches our body, it reaches our soul, it reaches our spirit, and that we are responsible before God. God's authority reaches beyond time, beyond the visible realm and into the invisible. And whether we realize it or not, We stand in the very presence of a God who is sovereign over every part of our lives. God wants us to see him as a loving and sovereign Father that wants to redeem his lost children. There is nothing that humans can do to overrule God. No created being can overthrow God. Human authority must always be ruled by and be subject to the overarching authority of God. And when we live in terms of that reality, everything else will ultimately find its place in the greater picture of life. So, what is the ultimate authority that's ruling in your life? I pray that you allow it to be Yahweh. We'll talk to you again soon.